Welcome to Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors, where we believe Benjamin Franklin's advice that an investment in knowledge pays the best interest, both in finances and in your life. Every episode teaches you personal finance and long-term investing in simple terms. Now, here's your host, Jesse Kramer.
Hello and welcome to episode 106 of Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors. My name is Jesse Kramer. Today, we're going to take a deep dive on a cool 2023 survey called Retirement Perspectives and Attitudes. It shines an awesome light in the minds of about 1,700 people who participated in the study, about half of whom are retired and the other half are planning on retiring soon. And we're going to learn some lessons and compare and contrast, and I think come away, no matter what stage of your financial life you're in, whether retirement is still decades in the future or you've been retired already for a number of years, I still think there's some really interesting things we can learn from this study. Before we dive into it, we'll do our customary review of the week. Thank you so much, everyone, for leaving ratings and reviews on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. This one's from Apple Podcasts, a 5-star review from C.D. Stewart, who wrote in and said, "Fantastic podcast. I've been listening to Jesse for the last year or so, and I absolutely love this podcast. Jesse is fantastic at breaking down complex topics into easily digestible pieces, along with the use of great metaphors. I like that he discusses the mindset and emotional side of finance while also providing practical nuts and bolts information that I can act on. I recommend this podcast to beginners and money nerds alike." Well, C.D. Stewart, thank you very much for the kind words. Drop me an email to jesse@bestinterest.blog, and I will get you set up with a super soft Best Interest t-shirt. As I was alluding to before, today we're going to dive deep on this Retirement and Perspectives study. About half of the people who responded to the study have already been retired, and the other half are planning on retiring soon. Of the retirees, about half have been retired for 2 or fewer years. So we're talking about retirees who are just dipping their toe into retirement for the first few months or for the first year. And then of the pre-retirees, about half of them are planning on retiring in the next 2 years. So in other words, there are a lot of people in the study who can speak to that final glide path into retirement and then what the initial touchdown. And again, up for the study, 90% of the respondents were between ages 50 and 75. So again, a lot of pre-retirees and a lot of post-retirees. The survey uncovers their perspectives, their preparedness, their expectations, and their major concerns when it comes to retirement planning. Another fantastic takeaway is to see how these two major cohorts of pre- and post-retirees, how they tend to either change their minds over time or how they thought one thing and then they realized retirement actually had a different way about it. In other words, that the major concerns of some of the pre-retirees end up being different than the major concerns for that of the post-retirees. The people who are retired, the retirees, have a benefit of been there, done that, while the pre-retirees can only imagine what the future holds in store for them. And that difference is vital. We're all naturally uncomfortable with the prospect of an unknown future, but it's so helpful to hear from such a large cohort of people actually living that future already. So first, a little bit about the authors themselves, because they deserve all the credit for putting this study together. Fritz Gilbert, who some of you might recognize from episode 62 of Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors. Fritz is the founder of the Retirement Manifesto, a personal finance blog dedicated to helping individuals achieve a fulfilling retirement. His writing emphasizes both the financial and the personal aspects of retirement planning. Fritz spent 30 years in corporate America, primarily in the aluminum industry, before retiring at age 55. And now post-retirement, he and his wife moved to a cabin in the Georgia mountains where they enjoy community involvement and charity work. The other co-author of the study, Eric Weigel, is the founder of Retire with Possibilities, a retirement coaching firm aimed at helping individuals design their journey into retirement. He holds an MBA from the University of Chicago and has extensive experience in investment management. And the way I want to go through this particular podcast episode is to present a certain finding from the study, discuss the differences, if they exist, between the pre and the post-retirees, and then add some of my own color based on my opinions or based on the clients I work with, the stories I've heard from them. So I'm not going to cover every single question from the study, but instead I'm kind of handpicking or cherry-picking the ones that I found to be the most interesting to dive into. The first topic to dive into, I think, is the question that the survey asked, which is, how would you rate yourself in terms of finding the perfect home and environment to spend your retirement years? 75% of the results of the study were positive, 20% were neutral, and 5% were negative. So in general, people are happy with their home choices or the places they choose to live, their environments. But that said, there was a big difference in how the two major cohorts of pre- and post-retirees, how they responded. The pre-retirees make up fewer of the happy respondents and make up more of the negative respondents. And I think this makes sense. If you're still a few years out from retirement, you might be a little anxious about where you'll end up and if you'll like it there. Will you downsize your home? How stressful is that process going to be? The process of moving and finding a new place. Are you going to move to where your grandkids are, to where your kids are, where they're living? Is that going to be what you want? And is it also going to be what they want, what your kids and grandkids want? Are you going to snowbird to somewhere warmer? Can you afford to do that? There are all these questions, and it's really hard to figure out what the ideal answers are. And it's hard to know for sure if you're going to enjoy those choices once you're actually in retirement. But that's the thing. Once you're in retirement, you have at least some of your answers. And if you don't like your answers, you have the time and the flexibility to move or to plan or to think about it and to ultimately do something about the fact that you aren't enjoying where you're living. So my takeaway from this is if you're concerned about your perfect home or your perfect environment where you're going to spend your retirement years, I think you can relax a little bit, because even if your situation isn't perfect on day one of retirement, you will still have time to figure out your plan from there. Again, I'm going to skip around the survey a little bit here. And the next question I want to tackle is the question of how would you rate yourself in terms of continuing to work on new meaningful goals? Now, interestingly, people who were more than 2 years before retirement, they rated themselves the highest in this dimension. Conversely, people who have been retired for more than 2 years, they had the lowest self-ratings. And another finding from this study is simply that many retirees struggle to find a purpose and meaning, especially in the first couple of years after retirement. So what can we do to ensure that we have purpose and meaning throughout our life, especially in retirement? The big thing is to stay connected. Loneliness really is the silent killer of retirement. And it's not just, loneliness isn't just a psychological or a mental thing. It really has physical ramifications too on our physical health. So brings us actually, I don't want to cut this question off too soon for this part of the study, but it does bring me to the next question worth pondering in the study. And the question was, how would you rate yourself in terms of the closeness and the quality of your relationships? 25% of the study's respondents self-reported that they longed for deeper social connections. So what do we do about this? Especially what do we do about this in retirement? Well, I think of routine social habits. I think we need to make socializing part of our baked-in routine. I have a friend here in Rochester who's, despite being, I think he's 80 or 81 right now, he's still sharp as a tack. He's still very active. He plays squash 4 or 5 mornings a week. And, I'm usually joining in 1 or 2 mornings a week on the double squash court. And he's just extremely active, whether it's volunteering, networking, going out to breakfast or lunch with friends who he's trying to keep in touch with, physically playing squash, going for walks. He's always doing something, and it's routine, right? His social interactions really are baked into his lifestyle routine. I think of a relative of mine who is very active in knitting and quilting groups in her retirement. It's 1 or 2 days a week, and it's the same groups of people, but everybody gets together and they're sitting there knitting or quilting or whatever it may be, and they're sharing stories and they're asking each other how they are. It's a weekly thing, right? It's built into the routine. I also think of a cafe here in Pittsford, a local cafe that will go to sometimes for my morning coffee meetings. And there's this rotating group of like 10 older men. And, sometimes it's these 7 guys are here one day and those 8 guys are here the next day, but kind of get used to the same characters. But they're in there every morning, or at least every morning that I'm there. There's always a group of these older men, retired men, getting coffee together, hanging out, chatting. A client of mine, she talks to me about going on these regular walks. She tries to go on a walk every single day. And as much as she can, she tries to invite different people to join her on a walk. So, sometimes it's routine where it'll be every Friday she walks with Nancy. And then, Wednesdays, it's every other Wednesday, it's Lucy or Betty and blah, blah, blah. You guys get what I'm saying. The whole idea is there's a routine. So maybe it's a book club, a church group, gardening, whatever. And a bonus thought here, because it can be hard, especially if we're not particularly outgoing, or, the idea of reaching out and what if they say no. And one thought, and this is a cool piece of advice I recently heard, is to don't try to find a best friend, right? You don't have to go out and try to find a best friend, but just try to be a friend. I think relationships really do blossom from that simple place. And I was listening to Vanessa Van Edwards recently, who's a very cool public speaker when it comes to kind of social interactions and relationship building and a few different things that I personally find interesting. And she cited a study, and the study was about basically why are likable people likable? Like, what is that trait that makes people likable? Is it that they're funny? Is it that they're good looking? Is it some form of like physical, subconscious athleticism that we notice in them? And the number one thing that all likable people have in common is that their list of people who they like is long. In other words, right, the most likable people in our lives, they tend to be the people who they see the world and they just find lots of people who they like. They just, I almost say it as they see humanity through rosy colored glasses. They see people who maybe are a little boring or a little quiet or a little plain, And they're like, you know what? I like that person. There's something, I like them. The more you like other people, the more those other people will like you back. So my takeaway there is to, we have to be pretty intentional about baking socialization into our routine. If we're seeking out new relationships, or if we're trying to forge new friendships because maybe we left a lot of friendships behind when we retired, when you go out and meet someone, it's find something to genuinely like about them. Because if you can convince yourself that you like people, a lot of those people are going to like you back. Now, the next question from the study that I want to dive into is, how would you rate yourself in terms of adhering to a healthy lifestyle? 22% of the study's respondents had a negative answer to this question, but the study does point out that where we fall along the work to retirement spectrum is probably immaterial to the healthy lifestyle choices we have in our life. Lifestyle habits, they really are habits. They're sticky and they're ingrained somewhere into our subconscious. And there's probably not a huge difference between people who are working and people who are retired in terms of adhering to a healthy lifestyle. But it does kind of beget a bigger question we need to ask ourselves, which is, what's the point of retirement at all if you're not healthy enough to enjoy it? I've had this conversation through the blog, through the podcast, here through work with clients before, people who spent decades saving diligently, they've built their wealth, they've planned wisely, and now, great, they've crossed the retirement finish line, like good for them, but something's missing. And what's missing, it's certainly not money. They have plenty of money. They have plenty of time freedom. The thing that's missing really is vitality. And it's not because they didn't care about their health per se. I mean, in some cases, maybe it is, but it's mainly because maintaining your health just gets harder and harder as you age. It's just biology. Dr. Peter Attia, who some of you might have heard of, the author of the book Outlive, he's like the go-to voice on longevity and aging. And he has a couple interesting concepts. One's called health span. One's called the centenarian decathlon. And the idea there is it's not just about living longer. It's not just about, instead of dying at 75, I want to die at 90. It's about living better for longer, right? It's about being strong enough and mobile enough and sharp enough to do the things that bring you joy into your 70s, into your 80s, even into your 90s. In other words, retirement shouldn't be about not working. It should really be about living to the fullest, playing on the floor with your grandkids, hiking the trails that you always wanted to hike, dancing at your grandchildren's weddings, those kind of things. But what Dr. Attia points out is that those things don't happen by accident. They take work, hard physical work a lot of the times, just like saving for retirement took work. Dr. Attia points out that by the time you're 60 or 65, you're already in a race against the clock. Your muscle mass is declining pretty quickly. Your balance gets worse. Chronic disease risk increases. So the time to prepare isn't really when you retire. It is the kind of thing where you got to start preparing today. I'm not a doctor, right? This is not medical advice. I'm certainly not here to hand out your workout plan or go to tell you to drink some kale smoothies or whatever that is. But I will say this. I've never heard a retiree or an older person say that they regret taking care of their body. Retirement is a season of life that's supposed to be full of joy and purpose and connection. But without your health, it's almost like you've been given this front row seat to the concert of your dreams and you forget your hearing aids. And actually, I don't know how hearing fits into this, but that's a separate conversation. The whole point is to take care of yourself now so that your future self can live life to the fullest. Here's a quick ad, and then we'll get back to the show. Did you know my written blog, The Best Interest, was nominated for 2022 Personal Finance Blog of the Year, and it's been highlighted in the Wall Street Journal, Yahoo Finance, and on CNBC? I love writing, especially when that writing is to share financial education, and I usually write 1 or 2 articles per week. You can read them all at bestinterest.blog. Again, the web address is bestinterest.blog. Check it out. The next question I want to dive into from the study is, how would you rate yourself in terms of having a clear vision and a plan for your life in retirement? A clear vision and a plan for your life in retirement. This question, it got the lowest proportion of self-reported strong or good responses of all the questions in the study. And that was specifically true for people who are yet to retire. So on the one hand, I hear that and I think, well, maybe the future is just too foggy for all of us to say we have a clear vision for retirement. Or perhaps many people, they don't want a rigid vision and a plan for retirement, but we don't want to wing it. We don't want to go into retirement with no vision at all. And it's a good reminder that retirement, again, it's not a financial event. Yes, finances are part of it, but retirement really is a life transition. And so if you are struggling with a vision or struggling with a plan, or simply if you want to start putting your vision and plan together, I think that's probably the best place to start. If you're already retired, hopefully that's something you've been doing or you've been working on it. I still think these exercises I'm about to go through will be helpful for you, but especially if you're a pre-retiree, and you feel like you don't really have good vibes when it comes to having a clear vision or having a clear plan for your life in retirement, here are 3 really interesting exercises that I think will help you. The first one is called the perfect day exercise. The goal of this exercise, as the name probably implies, right, is to create some sort of vivid picture of what your ideal retirement day will look like. And then you can work backward to build a life that supports that idea. Prompt would be, imagine you wake up in your ideal retirement life. What time are you waking up? Where are you? Who are you with? And then what do you do next? And then what do you do next? And then what do you do next? And who are you with for that? And who are you meeting up? And what's the weather like? What kind of activities are you doing? What are you eating? What are you drinking? How are you spending your time? So it's answering all those important, who, what, when, where, why, and how questions to build yourself an ideal day, soup to nuts of the entire schedule, from your morning coffee to your bedtime, including as much detail as you can possibly muster, sights and smells and people and activity, your dog, this walk, whatever it may be, playing this instrument, going to see this concert, going to play pickup basketball, whatever it may be, every single thing, as much detail as possible. And the whole idea is that we want to move the idea of retirement from vague to vivid. We want as much vivid detail as we possibly can. And the idea is once you can see that vivid image of your ideal day, you will be more motivated to build it. You will start to go through piece by piece. And I recommend writing this down because it is the kind of thing where, for at least maybe the way my brain works, is I want to write it down and I want to break it up into chunks. And I want to say, well, for this part of my day, how do I build a life that gets me that? For that part of my day, how do I build a life that gets me there? Going back to a couple other previous questions, where do I need to live to be able to execute this perfect day? How healthy do I need to be to execute this perfect day? What's the financial component involved of executing this perfect day? But again, if we can go from vague images of retirement to this vivid image of an ideal day, you will be motivated to go out and build it. The second cool exercise is called the Ikigai Map. And now Ikigai, it's one of those things where if you've heard of it, I feel like you probably think it's way overused. If you haven't heard of it, okay, I'll define it for you. It's a Japanese word, loosely translates to reason for being. And it's often shown and drawn using these 4 overlapping circles in a Venn diagram. And the 4 overlapping circles are labeled what I love, what I'm good at, what the world needs, and what I can be useful for. Again, this is what I love, what I'm good at, what the world needs, and what I can be useful for. And the goal of this exercise is to try to align your retirement activities with some sort of deeper sense of purpose and fulfillment. Again, what I would do is I would take an 8x11 sheet of paper. I would make these 4 circles, make this Venn diagram, or you can just Google it. You can Google the word Ikigai and find this Venn diagram in about 2 seconds, and then start filling in each circle. And especially think about the intersections, right? Think about that intersection in the middle. Are there activities that you love and you're good at, but also that the world needs and that you can be useful for? Now, that last one, what I can be useful for, I will say, I think there are versions of this Ikigai map where they say what you can be paid for. I mean, now that you're retired, you probably don't need to be paid for it, but it is the kind of thing where it's hopefully someone else in the world appreciates the fact that you're doing it. And depending on which circles are overlapping with what, or I guess the way I should say it is, depending on where your activities fall in this Venn diagram, you'll see, the combination of what you're good at and what you love is a passion. The combination of what you love and what the world needs, well, that might be a mission. The combination of, say, what you're good at and what you can be paid for, or what you can be useful for, that might just be a profession or something like that. But if all 4 of these things get fulfilled at once, that would be your Ikigai, as they say. And that's something to really focus on, because we want to think beyond just keeping busy. And we definitely want to move toward feeling useful and feeling alive. And then the last exercise of these 3 exercises is the rocking chair test. And the goal here is to clarify what really matters in the long run. And I always find these things challenging. I'm curious if you guys find them easier, where someone says, picture yourself in 20 years, picture yourself in 30 years. But that is the nature of this exercise, is to picture yourself 20 or 30 years from now, sitting down on your porch in your favorite chair, looking back on your retirement. Or again, if you're not retired yet, again, it's picture yourself at age 80 or age 85, looking backward on what your retirement has been. And what do you want to be proud of? If you're sitting in that chair 30 years from now, what do you want to be proud of? What do you want to have experienced? What do you want to have contributed or learned? How do you want to spend your time? Again, so this exercise works because it flips the script from the short-term wants of right now, of this week, of this month, and it zooms out to longer-term meaning. It encourages intentionality, not just activity. It reminds me of some of the exercises we talked before with Doc G on this podcast when it comes to some of the lessons that he learned when people are at end of life. Some of the lessons when people are they're in hospice, they're on their deathbed, and what are their biggest regrets, or what are the things that they cared most about in life. And what you often find is like, it's basically a version of don't sweat the small stuff, and that there are certain big factors in life that matter a lot more. And so I think if we use this rocking chair test and we think about ourselves in 20 or 30 years, or we think about ourselves as this old person sitting contentedly in their rocking chair, what do you want to be proud of in that moment? Or what do you want to have experienced in that moment? And that exercise, this rocking chair test exercise, I think can help us shape exactly what we want our vision and plan for retirement to be.
Here's a quick ad, and then we'll get back to the show. Serious question. Why do podcasters constantly ask for ratings and reviews? Yes, they do help highlight our shows to new listeners. They help strangers find us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. It's totally true and a good reason to ask for ratings and reviews. But I have something more important, at least more important to me. I want to know if you like this stuff. I want to know if you like my podcast episodes, my monologues, my guests, the information I share with you and the stories I tell. I want to improve and make your listening more enjoyable in the process. So yeah, I would love to read your reviews. And sure, if you throw a rating in there too, that's great. If you like what I'm doing, please share it with me. It's such a great feeling to read your feedback. I'd love to read your review or see a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Thank you.
Next, I want to pivot a bit to the last section of the study where the authors, Fritz and Eric, they specifically call out the biggest differences between the pre and the post retirees. I think a huge part of this section, a huge takeaway is that people think retirement is this particular way, but it turns out that it's actually that particular way. And having those preconceived notions kind of turned on their head is a really big takeaway that we can all take from the study. Now, for starters, the study found that pre-retirees are less worried than post-retirees about their health, about family crises, about economic and political turmoil. Instead, pre-retirees are much more worried about outliving their savings and rising healthcare costs. The post-retirees aren't nearly as worried about those things. So in other words, pre-retirees are worried most about the financial aspect of retirement. Post-retirees, those who have actually walked the walk, those who have actually been there and done that, post-retirees are much more likely to worry about the non-financial aspects of retirement. I think that's a huge takeaway. If you're a pre-retiree and you're really worried about your finances, I mean, listen, get those finances in order. That's kind of why we're here in the first place. That's a big thing that we talk about here. But you also have to realize that most of the people who have walked this path before you, maybe they were worried about finances too when they were your age. But now that they're actually in retirement, they are much more likely to worry about non-financial aspects of retirement. Okay, I want to hone in on the work and career section of this part of the study, because when it comes to your workplace, most pre-retirees still working, when they think about retirement, they don't feel like they're going to be very concerned about their social interactions from work and the fact that they really won't have those anymore in retirement. They're not really concerned about the mental stimulation they get from work and the fact that that might disappear in retirement. And they're not really concerned about the sense of identity that they get from their career and from their work. They figure out, they think something's going to replace that once they get to retirement. But most post-retirees reported all three of those concerns much more severely. In other words, it's not until your career ends and you actually retire that you realize how much you will miss your social interactions at work. That's when you'll realize how much you'll miss the mental stimulation of work. And retirement is also when you'll realize that you've lost your sense of identity, or some sense of identity that you had tied to being a professional. In other words, there's a decent chance that many of you listening right now might think to yourself, I'll be good without work. I'll replace the social interactions. I don't need work to define my identity. And some of you might be right, but many of you will end up being wrong. So my takeaway is to not underestimate those things. The social interactions you get from work are huge, and most likely you'll need to replace them in some way in retirement. The mental stimulation you get from work, right? It's 40 hours plus every single week. You'll need to replace that somehow in retirement. And then the sense of identity that we get from work. A lot of people out there are proud to have been an engineer, a teacher, a firefighter. I get great sense of identity from sitting here thinking to myself, I'm a financial planner, I write a blog, I produce a podcast. I like that as part of my sense of identity. And for that just to disappear overnight, I'm probably going to need to replace it somehow. I mean, I can't even really picture that myself. So anyway, that's something huge. And it's, again, a big lesson that we can take away where the pre-retiree assumptions do not line up well with the reality of retirement. But perhaps there's no better overall takeaway than this final question that I'll review today. The question posed in the study is, the transition to retirement was or will be smooth. So again, the question is, the transition to retirement either was or will be smooth. 75% of the pre-retirees still working, they responded in a positive manner to this question, and 20% responded in a neutral manner. Only 5% of the people still working believed that their transition to retirement would not be smooth and responded in a negative manner. But for the post-retirees, about half respond positively, 25% respond negatively, and 25% respond in a neutral manner. So my simple takeaway is that many people assume their transition to retirement will be smooth, and they end up being wrong. I suppose this entire podcast episode can be boiled down into that. Many people assume their transition to retirement will be smooth, and they end up being wrong. So my advice to you is to do your best, to do what you can to make sure that that is not you. We want a smooth transition into retirement. I think one of the most powerful things we can do, especially as planners, as DIYers, as people who care about our own future financial plan, our own retirement, is to listen. If we really try to hear from folks who have already crossed that retirement threshold, what will they tell us? It's very often different, as we've seen today. It's different from what we would expect as pre-retirees. It's different from what we might assume as pre-retirees. Before retirement, we imagine freedom and flexibility, no more meetings, no more alarm clocks. That's a nice one. And hey, some of that is true, but the retirees that I talk to at work, the retirees in this study, they share something deeper, something more honest. They say, you know what? I underestimated how much of my identity came from work. I didn't realize how quickly I'd have a reason to get up in the morning. No one warned me how lonely this could feel. Over and over again, I wish I had taken my health more seriously and earlier in my life. Because it's not just about the time when you retire. It's not just about the money. It's about having the energy, the vitality to enjoy the life that you built. Social connections too, right? They fade faster than we expect. The casual relationships of the office, maybe it's the banter, the camaraderie, they matter more than we give them credit for. Without a plan to replace those relationships, retirement can feel and often does feel surprisingly isolating. So the takeaway is not just to prepare your portfolio or your tax planning, but to prepare your life, to craft a vision, to build good habits, to nurture friendships, to prioritize your body and your brain. Because the people who tend to thrive in retirement, they aren't just lucky. It didn't just happen. They're intentional about it. They didn't just retire from something, their career. They retired to something. And that makes all the difference. So thank you again to Fritz, Gilbert, and Eric Weigel, and the couple thousand people in their audiences who participated in this study. Listeners, if you want to go check out that study for yourself, we are going to throw a link for you in the show notes. Thank you again for listening, and we will talk to you next episode.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors. If you have a question for Jesse to answer on a future episode, send him an email over at his blog, The Best Interest. His email address is jesse@bestinterest.blog. Again, that's jesse@bestinterest.blog. Did you enjoy the show? Subscribe, rate, and review the podcast wherever you listen. This helps others find the show and invest in knowledge themselves. And we really appreciate it. We'll catch you on the next episode of Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors. Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors is a personal podcast meant for education and entertainment. It should not be taken as financial advice, and it's not prescriptive of your financial situation.